last week I made a joke about having Muzak during this like awkward silence moment. I totally forgot about it this week. Maybe I'll do it next week. But I'm just gonna go ahead and get started, and I'll just admit people as they start logging in. But we seem to have what's approaching a quorum right now. So thanks everybody for joining us for the third panel of Transnational Equivalences and Inequalities. My name is Chris Fan. I'm an assistant professor in the English department here at UC Irvine, and I'm also affiliated with the Asian American Studies and the East Asian Studies departments. So I'll just say a couple things about the UC Speculative Futures Collective for those of you who are joining us for the first time, and apologies for the familiar boilerplate text to those who have heard it a couple times before. But thank you to those latter people for sticking with us these weeks. So the UC Speculative Futures Collective was established through a UC multi-campus research programs and initiatives grant at the end of 2018. Our symposia have brought together faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates, as well as artists, activists, and community members. Building on the premise that in order to create a better world, we first have to imagine it, the mission of the collective is to make space and provide funding for projects that develop speculative cultural forms and theories that might help to address issues of ecology, gender, sexuality, race, and inequality, among other issues. We insist on the importance of tarrying with the speculative, if not as a refurbished name for the creative imagination, then as a name for that precious space-time that is the prerequisite for emancipation's first move. So today's panel, the third in our series, the penultimate one, titled Knowing Toxicity, was assembled in February, just a few weeks before California issued its shelter-in-place orders. So not all of the presentations today deal directly with COVID, but each of them explores thematics that are related to COVID in ways that I predict we'll find especially bracing now, 7 months into what has apparently all along been the White House's herd immunity strategy. So our presentations today will link public health crises and the persistence of Orientalist racial forms, the US histories of permanent war, and Big Pharma's global pursuit of profits. Our presentations will also remind us that even though we often rhetorically posit that climate change and environmental collapse are the next challenge we'll have to face as a species, if there's ever an end to COVID, that in fact, no such distinctions exist between these disasters and that they're all part and parcel of the same ongoing catastrophe. Despite these dire topics, our presentations will also take up the speculative in the spirit of the Speculative Futures Collective's understanding of that term, an attempt to identify wiggle room for thinking toward another kind of future. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. One note before we dive into the first presentation. So we'll hold off just on the format of the symposium today. So we'll hold off on Q&A until after the presentations are over. But the chat is open to everybody. So if there are any questions that arise or comments and that you want to register via chat in the meantime, then go ahead and do that, and I'll be sure to get to those when we turn to Q&A. Okay, so one quick plug before we get started. So this is the penultimate panel of the symposium, and our final panel, Techno-Capitalism, will be next week on Friday, October 30th, from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. PST. So I hope to see everybody there. And thanks again to all the participants in the symposium for helping with promotion of these events. Our turnouts have been really, really wonderful. And just another side note, the videos of the past panels are up on the Speculative Futures website right now. So I encourage everybody to check those out. Okay, so on to our first presentation. Rachel Lee is the author of the award-winning book, The Exquisite Corpse of Asian American Biopolitics, Biosociality, and Posthuman Ecologies, as well as the editor of the Routledge Companion to Asian American and Pacific Islander Literature, both like extremely influential texts, not only in Asian American studies, but in science and technology studies, been very influential on my work personally. Rachel just completed a 5-year term as director of the Center for the Study of Women at UCLA and is currently finishing up the team-based project, Chemical Entanglements, Oral Histories of Environmental Illness, a collection of interviews with over 70 individuals living in the US and Canada whose family history, occupation, art practice, or activism have brought them into direct contact with illness experience and disability related to chronic low-dose exposure to toxicant chemicals. So Rachel, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Thanks so much for that introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here. Whoops. But let me get this going. Excuse the tech snafu. Okay, and let me start my timer as well. Hold on. Okay, here we go. All right, so as you'll see, I've changed my title slightly, and this is a work in progress, and the conclusion is more of a pointing in the direction that I can't cover in our short period today, so please excuse the roughness. A vanguard of scholarship in science and technology studies currently expresses dissatisfaction with current molecular frameworks. Max Byron, Manuel Tironi, Nerea Calvillo, Michelle Murphy, and Radine Chadin call for overcoming the magnetic pull toward the molecular, that is, the wayward molecule as it deviates from its proposed path to become a persistent bioaccumulative character that destabilizes the commons of soil, water, and atmosphere. They call for shifting focus toward the extractive structures in which practices of toxicity are embedded, the biopolitical systems of racism, coloniality, petrochemical capitalism, carcerality, transnational finance, ableism, misogyny, and cis and binary gender normativity that perpetuate toxicity. At the same time, there are signs that a turn in humanities and cultural studies scholarship toward the molecular and elemental may be upon us. In late 2016-17, Stacey Alamo and Nicole Starosileski launched the Elements book series at Duke University Press. This was preceded by Mel Chen's 2012 monograph on the animacy of mercury, an acknowledgement of non-human agency in alliance with a broader critique of Enlightenment humanism. Currently also, the Journal of Transnational American Studies is also fielding submissions for a special issue on the topic molecular intimacies. In other words, brewing here is a tension between, on the one hand, those who view the lexicon of chemistry as too overwhelming and alien to become rallying points in the popular imagination, and those who would encapsulate the necropolitical demerits of late 20th, early 21st century carbon democracy in the concreteness of a quote unquote toxic airborne event, whether fictive as in the noxious dark cloud in Don DeLillo's White Noise, or factual as in the mushroom nebulae produced by above ground nuclear bombs. So this essay is part of a larger work where I want to focus on 3 accounts of toxicity involving exposure to hazardous chemicals that make varying degrees of recourse to the molecular on the one hand, and to the extractive, necropolitical, and slowly violating systems of WSCAP, that is Leah Pipesna Samarsinha's acronym, along with others, for white supremacist, capitalist, colonialist, ableist patriarchy, so WSCAP. The first of these 3 texts is the episode 3 of the Netflix series Diagnosis, told in a forensic, realist fashion. The second is a vorticist poem by chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome activist Peggy Munson. And the third is an epistolary and imagist best-selling novel by Ocean Vuong, On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous. Through this comparison, I am developing the concept of polymerized violence as alternative to the figure of the toxic airborne event. And I would just note that for this presentation, I'm focusing mainly, actually exclusively on diagnosis with a little bow towards Peggy Munson at the end. Polymerization refers to a chemical reaction in which 2 or more molecules combine to form larger molecules that contain repeating structural units. While chemistry articulates the result of polymerization as a long chain of macromolecules suggestive of a linear sequence, the presentation of a polymer can be that of a tangle, as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. Knowing toxicity through a humanistic and human organismal fashion is to encounter the capitalist neoliberal state and its military poison complex as entangled with the molecular and the infrastructural. This combination produces complex assemblages of harm, of abandonment and zooification, irreducible to a singular instance of poisoning that can be litigated. Polymerized violence is resinous. leaving a sticky, slimy residue that oftentimes is inadequately apprehended through a double-blinded, controlled, experimental fashion. Arts and humanities offer a range of genres and figures with which to apprehend a toxicity tangle that is both molecular and tied to structures of settler colonialism, racism, extractive accumulation, and depletion of the commons of its reproductive capacity. So I'm going to just jump right in now to diagnosis, and I hope all of you are familiar with the series because I'm skipping over the summary of the series and jumping into episode 3, The Wisdom of the Crowd, which features Willie Reyes, there on your screen, aged 43, and family living in a rural region of Vado, New Mexico, and seeking help from New York Times columnist and Yale physician, Dr. Lisa Sanders. Not only has Reyes, a former tank mechanic in the US Army, lost his job working for the Bureau of Prisons in New Mexico because of his memory issues, he also has suffered a grand mal seizure and frequently becomes, quote unquote, emotional in daily life. He tears up easily, which is caught on camera. Despite 11 visits to the Mayo Clinic and a battery of neurological tests, including spinal taps and 2 brain biopsies, his doctors can only offer this rather limited description, inflammation unspecified. All the episodes are replete with authenticating documents signaling the processing of the patient's condition by conventional medicine. In Willie's case, these are shots of his MRIs, a list of his symptoms, such as lesions on the brain, memory loss, hearing loss, mood swings. There are also the cluster of diseases fielded as responses to Sanders' social media posting of Willie's story, which include obscure conditions like progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy caused by a viral infection, and an autoimmune disorder called neurobachette's, as well as more prosaic suggestions such as fungal infection and valley fever. Significantly, Sanders deliberately bypasses the many suggestions that Willie's symptomology resembles Gulf War illness, to which I will return shortly. Can everyone hear that ringing? I don't know how to turn it off, so I apologize if you're hearing that. The segment also gives camera time to how finances compound the challenges facing the Rays living in the now of disability. 3 talking head confessionals, starting with Willie's, explaining that he was denied early retirement and doesn't have health insurance, testify to how medical bills have put incredible stress on the family. Sandra, Willie's wife, in voiceover reveals that they have accrued $10,000 in debt and have had to put up the title to their mobile home to give them some breathing room. Daughter Serena says through tears, "I'm always thinking, does my mom, who now has to work 2 jobs, I'm always thinking, does my mom have enough money to get us a little more food? Because now we're just living off what my mom makes, and it's not really a lot." In conversation with internal medicine and infectious disease specialist Sarkar Swaminathan, Sanders admits that regarding Reyes' case, she's unusually confounded. "I've got nothing," she says to Swaminathan, who responds, "If he's gone to Mayo, they've ruled out 99.9% of what other doctors are going to think about. So either it's something unknown or everybody has anchoring biases they haven't thought about." The episode, in other words, deliberately narrates the myopia or anchoring biases of conventional US medicine. Addressing environmental scientist and GW researcher Kim Sullivan, Sanders admits to setting aside consideration of Gulf War syndrome because so many doctors had, quote unquote, poo-pooed it. "When was this an accepted diagnosis?" she asks, to which Sullivan responds that there is ongoing debate, but it is a, quote unquote, established disorder common among 30% of veterans who were stationed in the Gulf, around 250,000 individuals. So as we do know, background, lobbying by veterans themselves, so patient advocacy has been key to funding research on Gulf War illness and changing the criteria for covered treatment from VA hospitals. Normally though, if there are no established biomarkers to confirm an illness, nor a specific AMA codified treatment for it, then the disease is usually denied reality, which is to say relegated to the category of a somatoform disorder of psychogenic origins. After overcoming her own anchoring biases, Sanders does point the Reyes family in the direction of GWI, Gulf War illness. The camera films Sandra and Willie's genuine astonishment that not only had they never thought about Willie's service as a possible factor in his inflammatory condition, but that their Mayo Clinic neurologist, even when specifically prompted toward GWI, continues to feel that genetic tests for an autoimmune disorder is the way to go. This leads me to my first big point regarding episode 3. It serves as a mea culpa and revisionist alibi for the medical industrial complex, or MIC. Yes, we have anchoring biases, but the crowdsourcing experiment practiced by someone like Sanders can make select doctors better at what they do. Furthermore, the critique, but not outright condemnation, of the MIC's, medical industrial complex, financial ruining of patients, it's setting them up, and specifically brown female kin, for a kind of decades-long indenture to pay off debt, sits right next to, indeed has been incorporated into, this revisionist alibi for the MIC. So on this latter point, Sandra breaks down in tears of self-recrimination and inklings of anger on behalf of herself when GWI is presented as possibility. And this is the 4 stills that I put at the bottom of your screen. She says, it's like you rewind and you want to kick yourself. My thing is, we did 2 brain biopsies, 2 freaking brain biopsies, and not once did we think of Gulf War. And I hate it, because now it's like, damn, not once did it cross my mind. What is this elusive it that Sandra hates? Is it Gulf War illness? Is it the Gulf War? The uncertainty of diagnoses? Is it that medical professionals can charge so much? Is it that the MIC, with all its expensive equipment, can't overcome the toxicity of necropolitical seepage into civilian life in the homeland, as opposed to staying in foreign territory? And this is a genuine question, which I hope we can talk about in the Q&A later. To qualify for Gulf War illness covered care from the Veterans Administration, there must be, quote, no other cause for your disability or illness other than service in the Gulf, end quote. And that's from a disability litigation website. As Willie and Sandra leaf through his Army discharge papers, Sandra points out a slew of blank pages. I cannot change I cannot go forward. Here we go. Okay, here we go. And she says, this doesn't make sense. It's all mixed up. This is on your lower right. That has nothing. Is this merely poor record keeping, or is it the deliberate blocking of information? Regarding this bureaucratic oversight, Willie murmurs, it's hard to believe that they got us out with no information. He suspects that they exposed us to more than they said. Recall here that against the cornucopia of commodities that capitalist realism advertises as its primary products, Mark Fisher asserts that the disavowed, always masked or misrecognized real, with a capital R, of capitalist realism are the proliferations of bureaucracy and mental illness. Bureaucracy's icon in this instance is the incomplete, poorly Xerox file of Willie's medical records, punctuated by these words of Willie, who has indeed developed a mental illness, that is a mood and cognitive disorder. Quote, having other veterans tell me that the VA does deny lots of benefits and stuff we're entitled to, it gets me angry because we've served our time. Looking back at it, it's like they basically used people and then just throw them out, end quote. One might object here that it is the state, that is the DOD and VA, not a capitalist corporation, functioning as the bureaucratic entity unwilling to take on the expense of caring for Willie years after he left their employ, even though they recruited him into a hazardous occupation and failed to prioritize troop health and safety in the non-combatant aspects of their job. That is, they outsourced to private military contractors such as Blackwater and Kellogg Root and Brown, support services such as waste disposal. And I mention that because burn pits are a significant source of hazard exposure for troops that have served in the Gulf. Sorry. So polymerization in the Gulf War bespeaks hazardous practices of private military contractors that are immune to prosecution. Their debilities land or are paid by dysregulated brown soldier bodies, and the costs are socialized onto the VA, the taxpayer, and brown families. Bureaucracy, or the blank whiteness of no information, is an inefficiency that protects industry or materializes non-litigatable fault, even in the face of possible actual culpability. The affective tenor produced is something between sadness, madness, anger, the tearing up of Sandra, precisely because grief cannot be litigated as grievance, and so profits are protected and malfeasance continues. In short, one might be tempted to conclude that wisdom of the crowd is forensic, less toward the infectious, chemical, or immunological factors behind Willie's compromised neurological function, and more toward the families having their eyes closed as to the bureaucracy of the state, the DoD, and the incitement of mental mood disorders by the medical industrial complex, or MIC. The two share a for-profit extractive ethos toward those figured as their primary stakeholders, respectively patriot soldiers and client patients. And indeed, this is part of my reading of this Netflix show. But polymerized violence requires more. So for my remaining 5 minutes, I want to return to the framework of the molecular via the chemicals named and unnamed in this episode, and expand upon some molecular feminist alternative revisionings of how to think molecules in a way that enhance relationality rather than enhance industry profits and settler colonial extraction. So I'm going to skip over this section about sarin and cyclosarin. You can go look at the episode if you'd like, and skip to the feminists because I think this is more important. So the molecular conventionally stands for the minuscule or the microscopic and spatial scale of interaction. It is usually contrasted to the molar. So for instance, Dibalina Roy, who draws on Deleuze and Guattari in her book, Molecular Feminisms, speaks of the molecular as merely ordered, aligned, and aligned with becoming. And the molar, which it's contrasted to, is aligned with hierarchy and stasis. However, to my mind, the conjuring of the molecular, for instance, scientific and medical context, stresses the non-network, the isolated segment, the point being not to have to think the cascade of interactions from which that molecule derives and into which it continues to flow. That's that dual use notion of something just aligned with becoming and merely ordered, not already in an organism of hierarchy and stasis. To straight chemistry and toxicology, more funding is needed to fill the blank pages given airtime and diagnosis, again, with investigations as to what specific toxic molecules were catalyzed in the heat of the war. That is, if only given enough time, money, and regulatory prowess, science could identify and fill these pages. But I would suggest that the blank pages are also invitations to creatively speculate along the lines of femiqueer molecular thinkers to approach this nexus differently. So again, in Molecular Feminisms, Roy gives us an alternative figure to the rhizome, that is again from Deleuze and Guattari, aligned with the molecular. She gives us instead the stolon. So the stolon are the shoots of grass that grow laterally as well as up and down. And these grow above ground, whereas rhizomes are the stems that grow below ground. She uses this figure to talk about lateral cross-territorial strivings that play in the mode of the amateur and the experimental creative. And these are both within and adjacent to the experimental scientific. So even as stolons develop both, they're aligned with the stolonic is a strategy for becoming minoritarian and molecular, even as stolons develop both horizontal and vertical shoots. That is, the molecular is not opposed to the molar. I want to build out the queerer relationality of Willie Ray's condition to less what can be confirmed as mechanistically, molecularly a toxic condition, and more aligned to other idiopathic chronic illnesses such as MCS, multiple chemical sensitivity, and Lyme disease, chronic Lyme, via this notion of the stolon, the grassy sideways move to ally with for instance, in Peggy Munson's case, a white lesbian poet who's been an advocate for those with chronic fatigue for over 2 decades. If part of what bothers Willie about his neuroinflammation is that he is like a child, that was in my first slide, repeating things over and over, and if the episode provides a compensatory documentation of Willie's capacity to perform heterotransgenerativity, by holding a quinceanera party for his daughter Serena. That's how the episode ends. Perhaps what might interrupt most clearly and in a feminist molecular mode this text is its pairing with the neighborliness suggested by the work of Peggy Munson. Now, Peggy Munson has a poem published in the 2020 issue of Catalyst, the online journal, where it's called this Pantobacillin LA, and the speaker admits to having chronic Lyme disease. And this works. I want to point out that in the document that precedes the blank pages is this one. And I don't know if you can see it, but it actually says DOD something Lyme disease program. And you can see there was a mention here of ticks. This is never highlighted in the Netflix episode. And, you know, I felt very forensic looking at it, but nevertheless, this would disqualify, you know, Willie from Gulf War militarized, you know, adequate coverage, because there's something else that could confound and produce the same symptoms. I want to instead sort of go with this, you know, passed over medical record and say, well, what if we put him in the category of a polygenic disease, one that is polyancestral, doesn't have, you know, clear parents, what kind of idiopathic queer alliance could be construed out of that move? Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel, for that extremely rich presentation. So next up, we have Karen Siu, who is a PhD student in English at Rice University. Her research focuses on the intersection of Asian American literary studies and eco-criticism, human and non-human entanglements, environmental justice, and speculative fiction. Her most recent work concentrates on how contemporary Asian Anglophone novels grapple with and imagine a way forward from global emergencies such as climate change and COVID-19 in relation to the Asian American experiences of diaspora, discrimination, and immigration.
All right. Thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and to the entire Speculative Futures Collective. I'm not going to be using a PowerPoint for my presentation today because I've had it with technology. So my presentation is titled, Who is the Contagion? Assessing Coronavirus Outbreak Narratives and Speculative Futures in Unsuccessful Sea. The coronavirus pandemic has led to a rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, especially following President Donald Trump's use of the terms Chinese virus, China plague, and Kung flu in tweets and press briefings. Plenty of comparison has been drawn between the xenophobic racist language emerging from the pandemic and the 19th century, when immigration from China to the US surged and public health officials linked Chinatowns to outbreaks of leprosy, smallpox, and tuberculosis. Xenophobia and racism related to the coronavirus seem to be a renewal of yellow peril, with poet Cathy Park Hong stating that, quote, the recent rise carries the stench of late 19th century xenophobia. While there may be a stench, a trace of 19th century xenophobia and racism in the current moment, it would be reductive to assume that these racist utterances are all the same. Even though the anti-Asian language remains, the underlying anxieties of it have shifted. I explore these anxieties by examining Cheng-Rae Lee's Unsuccessful Sea, a novel depicting global environmental collapse, a dystopian America, and an affluent upper-class elite, the Charters, in fear of a disease called sea illness, sea implying Chinese. A growing tide of immigrants from Asia does not contribute to anti-Asian racism in Lee's novel, like in the 19th century. Rather, the anti-Asian racism from the coronavirus and sea illness in Lee's novel reflects anxieties about how dependent the US has become on China, the other, not only for the economy, but also for American health and well-being. Unsuccessful Sea prefigures the coronavirus pandemic by demonstrating that the emergence of diseases exposes an anxiety around dependency on Asian bodies. While being marked implicitly as disease, Asian characters and bodies in Lee's novel are the basis of the food supply chain, medical research, and domestic labor. In other words, care work in the novel depends on people who have been historically deemed a foreign contaminant. Yellow Peril then is no longer about waves of Asian immigrants pouring into the US. It manifests in our current pandemic and in Lee's novel as an anxiety over the reliance on China and Asian bodies for care work. For example, while anyone appearing Chinese has been blamed for the coronavirus, China supplies 48% of personal protective equipment and more than 90% of antibiotics imported to the US. Trump's former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, has called for the US to pursue, quote, new policies to prevent continued US over-reliance on China in our supply chain, end quote. What remains of American exceptionalism then when the US is exposed as not self-sufficient, needing what is seen as the other, China and Asian bodies, to take care of its own people? Lee's novel anticipates this question emerging from the coronavirus crisis by showing that even in a speculative future, anti-Asian racism remains, but in relation to the US's dependence on Asian bodies that are necessary for life. The story focuses on a 16-year-old girl named Fan, who hails from a city of working class laborers called Beammore, formerly known as Baltimore. Fan, a gifted fish tank diver, finds herself alone and pregnant after the father to her future child and the man she loves, Reg, has mysteriously vanished. She leaves home and sets forth in the dangerous anarchic open counties. Her sole purpose, find Reg. Fan never finds Reg by the end of the novel, but residents of Beammore even years later remember her, painting graffiti on the walls of the city in her honor. Unbeknownst to Fan, Reg had initially vanished because he was found to be immune to sea illness and was taken by the charters to be genetically tested on. Fan's body, bearing Reg's child, also becomes valuable because the baby may also be born disease-free. In fact, toward the end of the novel, Fan's brother, Li Wei, attempts to trade her and her unborn baby for his own financial gain. Untouchable Sea concludes with Fan's disappearance. No one knows what happens to her or her child. Turning first to Contagion in Lee's novel, direct references to sea illness are sparse. Little is known about how it spreads, its effects, or its symptoms. What we do know about sea illness is that it causes many different kinds of pains, often results in the eventual death of patients, and is, quote, unrelenting. In one less affluent community, it pretty much afflicted every, quote, adult. The novel explains that nobody goes sea-free, but the wealthy charter villages will not accept or stop from seeking a cure with their seemingly inexhaustible resources that function as an obscuring veil to the reality of sea illness. Sea in sea illness is not clearly coded as Chinese. Dr. Christopher Fan, one of our fantastic conference organizers, makes note of this ambiguity in his article on animacy in Untouchable Sea and points out that the sea, quote, strongly implies cancer while also inviting interpretations like in China, end quote. While his article does not delve into which interpretation is more likely to be the sea, we can consider sea to stand in for China or Chinese, mirroring Trump's language, given that the name of the most promising treatment of sea illness prior to the realization that Reg, as well as Fan's child, may be immune, is named Assimil, short for assimilation. There are only 4 references to Assimil in the novel, and each one is either said in brief or in passing. What we do know about Assimil is that it is the result of breakthrough genetic research by Fan's brother Li Wei, offering a potential remedy to sea illness through serial therapies. Andrea Kitta claims in her book, The Kiss of Death, that perceived patient zeros in popular outbreak narratives are often considered as outsiders. Geographical location, activity, race, ethnicity, and sexuality, and other factors that mark them as outsiders to the dominant group, which is white, mostly male North Americans. She continues by arguing that in real life, quote, the threat of contagion or contamination is not from the outside, but rather the disease is coming from the inside. To disrupt this narrative, Kitta states that insiders must be made into outsiders. She refers to what Priscilla Wald calls in her book Contagious Cultures as monstrous hybrids, These people are both insiders and outsiders at the same time. Wald defines these monstrous hybrids as people who are human viral hybrids, such as super spreaders who contain and spread a virus. Wald uses monstrous as a descriptor because in epidemiological horror stories, those who spread diseases are, quote, not strangers, but transformed familiars, neighbors, family members, and spouses, for instance. What we have in Untouchable Sea is an extension of Kitta and Wald's notion of hybridity. As one of the best fish tank divers, someone who husbands and nurtures fish, Fan plays an important role in Be More, a labor settlement that provides much of the fish and other foodstuffs for the charters. Fan is a model worker, a valuable member of the community for Be More, and by extension for the charters, that is until Reg's disappearance. Because of Fan's crucial role in food production, we can consider her to be an outsider, but Fan and Reg can also be considered outsiders as well as insiders because the charter villagers, except for a few outliers, are predominantly white, and Be More is a racially segregated settlement with its workers exclusively of Chinese descent. This is similar to how Asian Americans, while representing 6% of the overall US population, make up 18% of healthcare providers in the US. Yet Asian Americans are still stigmatized as foreigners in the coronavirus pandemic. Whether it's providing health care or maintaining food supply, the care work done by Asian Americans in real life and in the novel should make them part of the larger US community. However, of course, this is not the case as anti-Asian racism persists in the US and within this novel. For Kitta and Wald, hybridity refers to both being human and viral, like a seemingly unhealthy, non-threatening family member, familiar. Untouchable Sea maintains their idea of hybridity, but inverts it. Instead of the novel, we have Asian American characters who are deemed to be outside by their supposedly foreign race and ethnicity, but later turn out to be healthy carriers of genetic code that can possibly offer a cure to sea illness. By situating the possible cure to sea illness within working class Asian Americans, Lee resists the history of yellow peril in which Asians are deemed to be dirty, diseased foreigners threatening the US. There is no single person, race, or ethnicity from which sea illness originates, but Fan and Reg are a kind of patient zero for the cure to the illness. In the novel, then, Asian bodies represent care work in two ways. One, they maintain the charter food supply as working class laborers, and two, they are the literal embodiment of a possible cure to sea illness. The anxiety around the reliance on Asian bodies to provide care work for the charter villages is clear when the charters are quick to quell protests and unrest in Be More towards the end of the novel. Despite sea illness's name, which implies that the disease originated in China or among those of Chinese descent, there is no safe retreat. There are no walls that charters can erect to keep out sea illness however much they try. What may truly immunize the community of Be More, the charters, and beyond are Fan and Reg. The novel specifically focuses on the importance of Fan and her unborn child as what could save everyone, because, quote, for within her was the one promise that could deliver us, the seed of all our futures, charters' and Be More's, and even the shunned souls outside in the counties. And Fan disappears at the end of the novel. It is unknown what happens to her child, or Reg. The charters, in their anxious and relentless attempt to immunize, push out, and possibly destroy the very means or the promise of a cure, Fan and Reg, they auto-immunize to the point where they treat Asian American bodies, Fan and Reg, as if they are outsiders, a non-human contagion that needs to be attacked or eliminated, just as Asian American healthcare providers today are met with racial hostility while providing essential care work. Asian bodies in Lee's novel are targeted despite embodying the cure to sea illness. Even if Fan literally represents hope for the cure as the seed for all our futures, she is still treated as an outsider to be hunted and destroyed. Thus, in this vision of a speculative future that Lee's novel offers, Asian bodies simultaneously remain as hybrids. They are insiders and outsiders, productive workers, and model citizens, but also contagious foreigners and outsiders, despite embodying the cure. The care work performed by Asian bodies for charter people in relation to diseases in the novel also extends to sexualized, fetishized labor. Two older white characters, Quig and Lauren, from the anarchic open counties, attempt to trade Fan with the charters for equipment necessary to drill fresh water and a cure for Lauren's son, who is afflicted with a chronic illness that was, quote, certainly treatable, but so fantastically expensive that only the affluent charters could afford it. Fan's body here is valuable for care work because in trading her away, Quig and Lauren gain the means to provide their camp of people with clean water and treatment for Lauren's son. Despite how Lauren calls Fan, quote, little new China bitch, end quote, at one point, Fan still consents to be traded away because she befriended Lauren's son and Quig. However, it is unclear if Fan is fully aware that Quig and Lauren's intentions were to sex traffic her to a white charter couple, Mr. Leo and Miss Kathy. Fan is in fact close to being assaulted by Mr. Leo when Miss Kathy saves her by hitting her husband in the head. But instead of releasing Fan, Miss Kathy seeks to keep Fan as her pet, unaware of her real age and her pregnancy. Similar to how Fan is valuable to Quig and Lauren because her racialized, sexualized Asian female body is necessary for life, that is, Lauren's son's recovery, Fan's body also becomes necessary for Miss Kathy's life. In the novel, a permanent ban on all animals was enacted after various flu epidemics, separate from sea illness, crossed the species barrier, killing dozens of wealthy residents. The ban results in the, quote, uncommon but growing charter practice of keeping, end quote, human beings as pets. This is what Miss Kathy does to Fan and what she has in fact done to 7 other girls of Asian descent. As Miss Kathy's beloved pets, the 7 girls and Fan as the 8th perform effective labor for her, providing companionship, giving her their undying devotion, and allowing themselves to be groomed by Miss Kathy. The girls even take turns sleeping in the bed next to Miss Kathy's, but at some point in the night, the girl and Miss Kathy would switch beds, quote, something about the temperature and the smell of a girl's just vacated bed, helping Miss Kathy go back to sleep after she awoke from her nightly bad dream, end quote. The status of the girls as Miss Kathy's pets mirrors what Donna Haraway argues in the Companion Species Manifesto, that pets deliver the fantasy of unconditional love. Altogether, Fan and the girls promote this fantasy of love for Miss Kathy, and the novel confirms their care work because, quote, the primary dream of keeping is the dream of consolation, end quote. It is important to note that Miss Kathy's choice in Asian girls is deliberate. Her preference is for a particular kind of pale, docile, saccharine sweet Asian. Miss Kathy's girls have identically altered eyes resembling those of anime characters, which made them look deeply attentive, like some puppy or doe. The novel actually contrasts the girls and their stereotypical Chineseness to a minor character named Mala, Miss Kathy's housekeeper. Mala is, quote, an Asian of some kind, but her skin was quite dark, end quote. The narrative speculates she is either from Vietnam, Indonesia, or the Philippines. What is certain, though, is that Mala is from the Oban counties, which stands in for the third world in the novel, with the first world represented by the charters and the second world by labor settlements like Bmore. Through Mala, we see care work as reflected in our reality. A woman coming from the third world coming to the first world of the charters to perform domestic labor. Mala, according to racial and ethnic stereotypes, makes for a fitting domestic worker, while the stereotypical pale, gentle, and submissive Chinese girl makes for an ideal pet for Miss Kathy. For Fan, the care work provided by her racialized, sexualized Asian body in the novel occurs, importantly, in relation to contagions. Fan's body provides Lauren's son with necessary treatment for his chronic illness, and in the absence of non-human pets due to flu epidemics, Fan provides care to Miss Kathy. Fan shows that white characters in the novel, particularly the charters, rely on Asian bodies as a means for care against various effects of contagion. But whether as contagion or cure, Asian bodies, such as fans, do not escape from being racialized, sexualized, or fetishized. The vision of a speculative future in Lee's novel does not imagine Fan in her role as care worker and even the possible cure to sea illness as free from these racial and sexual stereotypes that burden her body. The notion of Asians as participating in care or cures in Lee's novel towards alleviating contagions does not escape racism, xenophobia, or sexism. Again, Lauren sums up these sentiments succinctly by calling Fan little new China bitch. Lauren blurts out the slur to Fan in a moment of anxiety and vulnerability when she's nearly killed by cannibal travelers and when she thinks Fan betrayed her. But Fan does end up saving Lauren. All the characters who rely on Fan feel anxiety over the thought of losing her. Lauren depends on Fan in order to save her son. Quig depends on her for the drill equipment. Miss Kathy depends on her for the love and affection of a pet, and all the charters depend on her for the possibility of a cure to sea illness. These characters who depend on Fan as either care or cure are white Americans who express anxiety over the thought of losing their valuable female Asian body. This resembles how Trump's administration has warned against over-reliance on China, but still heavily relies on Chinese medical supplies in the current pandemic. In Unsociable Sea, it is because Fan, the other, is so necessary that she is a threat. Rather than treating Fan like a familiar or an insider, the charters, Lauren, Quig, and Miss Kathy control her and attempt to capitalize on her racialized, sexualized body, her Chineseness or her otherness. Similarly, rather than Asian American healthcare workers being respected for their essential care work, nowadays many are subject to racism and xenophobia while on the job. Anti-Asian racism remains today, but not exactly as Yellow Peril outlined. As a speculative future of Chang-Lei Rayleigh's novel shows us, it is bound up in reckoning with dependency on the other. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. And seeing Scott give you an applause right there, but silently, reminds me that that's one of the things that's missing from the Zoom format, is our presenters not being able to hear the appreciation immediately. So we'll give everyone a round of applause at the end of the presentations and before Q&A. But up next, we have Scott Volz, who is a fourth-year PhD candidate in visual studies at UC Irvine, specializing in modern and contemporary art history with a particular interest in land and environmental art. His research concentrates on art's intersections with environmental politics, the visual culture of American environmentalism, and aesthetic interventions in waste practices. Scott's dissertation, Aftermath, Waste and Ecology in Art of the 1970s and 1980s, explores artistic responses to problems of ecological violence in urban, technological, and geopolitical arenas, focusing specifically on artists working in Greater New York City. Scott received a BA in art history from Kent State and an MA in art history and criticism from Stony Brook University. He's a co-founder of the Climate Futures Collective at UCI. Scott.
Thank you, Chris, for your introduction. Thank you also to the UC Speculative Futures Collective and to everyone who is here today. I am going to share my screen and get started. Okay. In 1996, Mark Dion and Alexis Rockman, two contemporary artists interested in ecology, published an edited volume on the intersections of nature, technology, and society. Titled Concrete Jungle, a pop media investigation of death and survival in urban ecosystems, the book studies the pests and weeds that occupy modern cities, looking in particular at their imbrication with waste. As opposed to wildlife literature featuring dramatic portrayals of megafauna roaming free, Concrete Jungle considers the unsightly world of vermin. It exchanges transcendental wilderness for the harsh environs of alleyways, sewers, and landfills, where a dense, unwanted ecology has taken shape. Eight extensively illustrated chapters devote attention to the subjects of invasive species, cats and dogs, rats, parasites, trash, and roadkill, as well as urban ecological dynamics more generally, and the representation of nature in zoos and natural history museums. As a critical cultural text, Concrete Jungle operates in three main ways, all of which are tightly intertwined. The first is to explore material that seemed, at the time of its publication, alien to much environmentalist thinking. While there is a long history of activist concern with public health issues in urban contexts, especially regarding waste and disease-spreading animals like rats and cockroaches, the book assumes a naturalist approach in order to inspect the ecological dynamics that cause urban animals to flourish. In particular, it charts the circulation of pests and weeds within the city ecosystem to reveal how the destruction of one habitat inevitably gives rise to another. Biodiversity loss and the corresponding spread of rapidly reproducing organisms forms an important leitmotif throughout the book. The second way Concrete Jungle operates is to consider visual and material cultures invested in urban non-human natures. This includes both amateur and institutional objects and structures that are alternately centered on the observation, elimination, and/or management of specific flora and fauna. The book features writings by and conversations with ethologists, exterminators, rat enthusiasts, museum professionals, and other figures who intersect with urban ecologies. There is even a connoisseur's selection of recipes for preparing and cooking roadkill. Third, Concrete Jungle serves, like much of Dion's previous work in sculpture, to deconstruct representational codes that frame the production of scientific knowledge. The book strikes a paradoxical affective balance between the visceral and the dispassionate. On the one hand, it is replete with content meant to repulse and amuse the reader. Black and white pictures of rotting animal carcasses, squirming rats, parasitical feeding, and biological decomposition fill each page. On the other hand, the book exerts a clinical interest in death and decay. While the many images of animal carrion and other pictures might disgust the reader, they're presented with factual impassivity, emulating the removed rhetorical style of scientific representation. The use of grainy black and white reproductions over color images reduces pictorial detail and eliminates the emotional investments that might be associated with particular color schemes. Like an instructional text, most of the photographs are accompanied by explanatory captions. These are largely cool in tone, and they serve to distance the viewer/reader from unseemly content. The caption beneath a gruesome picture of a dead dog, for example, explains what likely led to the animal's demise and deformation. Other, more ludicrous images, such as the visualization of a future breed of flying canines, are treated with the same logical restraint. Now, what this three-pronged structure serves to do is to subvert inherited representations that locate nature at a distance from the urban and usually portray it with a palatable aesthetic constitution. In contradistinction to the sublime or rustic imagery still prevalent in wilderness visual culture, Dion and Rockman privilege urban spaces and the living things that thrive in them in order to take apart the binary opposition categorizing cities as discrete places of non-nature. Indeed, the year after Concrete Jungle was published, so in 1997, biologist Daniel Botkin and historian Charles Beveridge observed that urban ecosystems remained relatively marginal subject matter within modern environmental discourse. The standard attitude towards cities consequently has more often dismissed them as sites of artifice and pollution that stand morally and materially in contravention to environmental conservation and the wilderness ideal. More recently, media theorist Nicholas Holm has extended these ideas to argue that urban fauna, such as rats, possums, and squirrels, are likewise commonly considered lesser or unnatural forms of life. This categorization excludes them from environmental calculations and makes it more difficult to understand the city as an ecosystem in its own right. Therefore, Holmes suggests that focusing on such anti-animals, his words, can bring urban ecologies into focus and reveal the city to be not simply a degraded space, but an alternate nature where biological arrangements are reconfigured. In the remainder of this presentation, I want to consider techniques Dion and Rockman use to visualize the city ecosystem, particularly in its imbrication with waste, connecting the epistemology of urban nature with the political critique of the unequal distribution of pollution that environmental justice movements have articulated. They ask, quote, "What does nature mean to city dwellers? Where do we find it? The impulse to environmental protection may sometimes be at odds with social justice. Where do we put the waste, the dumps, the incinerators? Who will have access to unspoiled wilderness and how?" And there I should note that they are using the phrase unspoiled wilderness. Ironically, they're not buying into that fiction. With such questions in mind, Concrete Jungle works to disclose unmarked cultural influences that define the spatial and conceptual limits of nature, designating what gets preserved and what polluted. In this, pests and weeds serve as an investigative optic, a point of departure for articulating the links between environmental degradation and the pathways of colonialism, militarism, and commodity exchange. As I argue, by exploring the unnerving, uncanny, and unusual elements of pests and weeds, Concrete Jungle locates a critical perspective from which dynamic engagements between the built environment and the more than human world can be apprehended. What problems do such techniques potentially produce, and what interpretive responses might be summoned from this material? I'll start with the problem, and I'll actually circle back to the problem at the end of this essay. Relishing what Patricia Yeager called rubbish ecology, the act of saving and savoring debris, Concrete Jungle risks being overly infatuated with the alternate natures laced into waste matters. That, in other words, the analytical mobilization of pests and weeds the book pursues slides inadvertently into agnostic observation of, rather than political anger over, bad environmental practices. In fact, Concrete Jungle was harshly received by some upon its release. One scathing review, written by a science educator, found little value in its speculative and absurdist content. The author condemns Dion and Rockman for promoting eco-illiteracy, criticizes their text and image combinations for being irrelevant, and argues that the book actually legitimates anti-environmental politics rather than taking a clear stance against them. The closing words of the review lament, quote, "It is bad art, worse science, and abysmal education, and I am still left feeling robbed the hours of my life wasted to read it in the first place," end quote. A punishing few lines, this sort of strictly negative review could ordinarily be dismissed as a hatchet job, offering less analysis than diatribe. But the charges of anti-environmentalism and eco-illiteracy that it levels against its subject evoke the terms of environmental struggle, debate, and reaction that informed shifting understandings of nature during the 1990s, when arguments over its social construction were drawing sharp dividing lines between scholars in multiple disciplines. In his study of environmental crisis discourse, Frederick Buell argues that the social constructionist critique of nature and related concepts, although an important discursive intervention, nevertheless played into the hands of conservatives who seized upon such ideas to attack conservationism, justify extraction, and excuse pollution. Since untouched wilderness never truly existed, they wagered, public lands ought to be made commercially available to industry. Indeed, it is telling that the editorial introduction to the journal in which the above book review was published itself scrutinizes rhetorical strategies that dirty corporations employ to favorably shape public opinion towards pollution emergencies. Buell thus urges social constructionist critics to politicize their discourse in unambiguous defense of environmentalist causes so as to preclude cynical right-wing appropriation. To take an example of how rubbish ecology might backfire in Concrete Jungle, consider the dystopian dioramas that populate various pages. Sharing the same title as the book, these images were produced by Dion and Rockman in multiple media, including oil painting and sculpture, in the years prior to its publication. In one, reproduced as the frontispiece to the first chapter, a house cat crouches beside a seagull and peers into the distance, guiding the viewer's gaze past two quarreling junkyard dogs and onto a mountain of trash. The composition is set in one-point perspective and employs the cat as the viewer's surrogate. The vanishing point, situated at the foot of a garbage heap in the far right midground, physically positions the viewer on the periphery of the image in line with the house cat. Organized so, converging orthogonal lines, which we can trace from the left like so, locate our eyes on the faintly visible lower Manhattan skyline, which appears like an apparition behind a veil of smog. But if the spatial construction of this scene tells us where to stand and where to look, the pile of refuse assembled at the foot of the composition bars passage inside. It presents a barrier between the external world, where we are located, and the interior setting, where the gulls, the house cat, the rats, the cockroaches, the dogs, the crow, and so on, all intermingle. Hence, we can only enter this picture with the house cat, who stands and looks for us as our vehicle. We must assume more than human form in order to circulate within the wastescape before us. This space, in other words, although overflowing with traces of human civilization, is situated beyond the human. The figurative and perspectival realism deployed in this construction and its displacement of the human onto the animal parodies habitat dioramas found in natural history museums. It concentrates on representational techniques such institutions utilize to construct fantasies of primordial nature that appear to be objective and truthful, but which smuggle in contested social values. Yet, in this, perhaps pushing the wilderness critique too far, the dioramas risk turning spoofs of museological spectacle into the splendor of waste, luxuriating in scenes of abject environmental fallout as ironic deconstructions of older wilderness ideologies. This inversion constitutes a recurring pitfall within contemporary environmental imagery. Grappling with Louis Helbig's and Edward Burtynsky's entrancing photographs of petrocultural landscapes, for example, art historian T.J. Demos argues that sublime representation of oil pipelines, refineries, and drilling fields turns fossil fuel infrastructure into places of optical delight, thereby effacing the material conditions undergirding the oil industry, as well as the lived experience of those displaced by it. In both Concrete Jungle and the latter photographs, the images can produce, or at least risk yielding to, a feeling of awe-filled helplessness. The scale and magnitude of petrochemical technologies or the insurmountable excess of garbage brackets actionable observation in exchange for passive scopophilic consumption of an uncontainable violence. The viewer is subdued by the overwhelming power of the problem depicted, but placated by the visual pleasure it offers. However, in the case of Concrete Jungle, there is, or so I would argue, something perhaps worthwhile in this pleasure. It is not merely a dispassionate inscription of beautiful form with no account for content that readers find inside the cover. Rather, staying with Buell, what Concrete Jungle offers is a particular economy of feeling, an affective production that repulses proprietary norms with engrossing subject matter. By examining biological organisms that flare up precisely where efforts to control nature break down, Concrete Jungle participates in what Buell refers to as a post-1990s crisis imaginary. Writing at the turn of the millennium, he maintains that a shift has occurred in cultural understandings of catastrophe, no longer an impending future threat looming on the horizon as it was formerly formulated within environmental literature. Crisis now appears in imminent terms as the immediate unfolding conditions of everyday life. As such, Buell outlines two possible environmentalist responses to this state of living in crisis, as he calls it. The first tracks most explicitly with wilderness and biodiversity preservation. It continues in the, quote, many-stranded nature tradition of valuing, defending, experiencing, and scientifically investigating ecosystems and biota, end quote. By contrast, the second response, which Dion and Rockman explore, manifests the specifically urbanized modes in which society interpenetrates, disrupts, and reconfigures the natural environment. It demonstrates entanglements between social conflict and environmental degradation, and it marks the rise of increasing uncertainty and risk. With these changing conditions, Buell advocates affective practices that, quote, extend erotic, marital, parental, filial, and other kin feelings to environmental relationships. They need to consider intimacy, nurturing, education, caring, embeddedness, embodiment, exposure, and vulnerability as crucial aspects of environmental as well as social human experience, end quote. It is here then where the absurdist and speculative components of Concrete Jungle become most salient. For this material is not limited to discourse on extant urban natures and related strands of environmental damage, although it does very much consider those topics. Rather, it imagines new possibilities for interspecies cohabitation that is based in an understanding of evolutionary adaptation and cooperation, but which projects future biological arrangements between humans and non-humans. Numerous contributions to the book consider reciprocal changes interspecies connections induce or have induced, cultural practices that over time shape animal behavior, which in turn alters or incurs into human socio-urban negotiations, open up, for Dion and Rockman, potential modes of being together that exceed anthropocentric diagrams of control, much like rats chewing through concrete. To choose one example with which I will close this essay, a segment on dog breeding conjures up a number of fantastically versatile canines that might come into being in a future where present modes of industrial food production have collapsed. The idea suggests that marketing commodified pet animals is ultimately untenable without a sustainable food system to support them. Quote, moral society simply cannot support beef ranches, hog barns, and chicken farms that waste grain and cropland, destroy rainforests, erode topsoil, and consume and pollute water. Therefore, when meat eating inevitably becomes taboo, what will dogs eat? End quote. The author, artist Gerald Heffernan, goes on to catalog a series of hypothetical vegetarian breeds that would serve utilitarian, social, and ecological purposes, including flying bat-like insectivorous dogs, which I alluded to earlier, epidemic control dogs, anthropomorphic population control dogs who substitute for human toddlers, and that one is visible at the left, and photosynthetic dogs, metabolizing light and capturing atmospheric carbon. While humorous, the breeds imagined here reformulate the human-animal relationship from one of ownership and consumption to one in which biophysical processes, the larger ecological conditions of the relationship itself, are explicitly factored in. Put in outlandish terms, the figure of the dog is used to materialize the bacterial, chemical, and corporeal exchanges that take shape within a given environment. It thus questions normative boundaries that mark, mediate, and divide different organisms, and encourages that those boundaries be reconsidered. Who exactly does that reconsidering, however, is not addressed. And this is a critical oversight in the book that is not unrelated to the skepticism of its visual techniques I voiced earlier. Despite the important critical connections Dion and Rockman make between, for example, colonialism and invasive species, or in other words, between white supremacy and environmental damage, Concrete Jungle fails to define power relationships between different groups of people within the city ecosystem. Who is accommodated and who is decentered by the reimagining work it seeks to set in motion does not come up. Thus, while attention to urban natures as significant ecological markers constitutes an important first step, without a more elaborated focus on specific environmental justice concerns, the speculative components Concrete Jungle draws upon risk losing critical purchase. A segment on flying dogs remains merely absurd, or a subversive diorama becomes an ambivalent infatuation with garbage. What Concrete Jungle offers then is an opening, a line of flight, for reckoning with the urban landscape as ecological, but it requires, just as Buell suggested in another context, further overt politicization. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. That was wonderful. So our final presentation today is from Sümeyra Buran, who is a full-time tenure-track assistant professor of English at Istanbul Medeniyet University. Since December 2018, she has been working as a visiting assistant professor at UC Riverside. Her teaching and research areas are British literature, Eurasian literature, Turkish science fiction and speculative fiction, women writers, women in science, science fiction, post-humanism, technology and science, technofeminism, technoculture, cyber and cyborg studies, human animal studies, race and ethnicity, women, gender, sexuality studies, Anthropocene, and environmental humanism. So very much in line with the thematics that we're concerned with here with the, among the Speculative Futures Collective. She's the editor of the Journal of Posthumanism and a book series collection on posthuman studies by Transnational Press London. She's a commission member of the Unit of Women's Studies in Academia at the Council of Higher Education in Turkey, a scientific coordination committee member of the European Observatory on Femicide, and the founder of the Center for Human Rights at Istanbul Medeniyet University and the Turkish Observatory on Femicide. So Sümeyra, welcome, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this short introduction. I would like to thank UC Speculative Futures Collective and Shelley, Nella, Neda, and especially Chris for organizing such an amazing conference. Today I will talk about environmental toxicity and reproductive sterilization of women. As we are closing to the end of 2020, the world is suffering from the coronavirus pandemic, racism, xenophobia, and sexism. We live in a world full of toxins and potential toxic exposures. When these toxins enter our bodies, we cannot be detoxified easily in our era of environmental toxicity. The 21st century has created a new wave of environmental disaster fiction, a movement which sets out to rethink the narrative texture of the present in a shadow of eco-catastrophe. As Raffaella Biccolini claims, dystopian fiction is to warn readers about the possible outcomes of our present world and entails an extrapolation of key features of contemporary society, unquote. Sarah Hall's Daughters of North, published in 2007, is a dystopian response to climate change and economic collapse caused by global warming and human capitalist attempts and pressures. The title of the novel, Daughters of North, refers to a group of women who refuged to nature. They escaped from the dictator regime called the Authority, the American regime forces, which rules the Britain after environmental collapse. I examined the novel through the lens of the battle between the nature mother's reproductivity and the capital patriarchal authorities' environmental sterilization policy. From the lens of the novel analysis, I aim to explore how the new world order after the collapse offers a new normal life that we need to learn to stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway claims. I call the novel as a green dystopia as a reference to most common names for the time of new epoch, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and Thulocene. Hall's novel portrays a green dystopian Britain, which has collapsed as a consequence of climate change, social and environmental corruption, political and economic breakdown due to patriarchal-oriented capitalist destruction and war. But it regains hope through the revolt of women living in a pastoral landscape. I argue that green dystopia means green within a dystopic future that becomes a utopia within dystopia, or hope in the dark, as the main character's sister in the novel says, quote, "The only thing left for me was to hope. It was hope that nourished me day after day," unquote. Since 2000, the present geological time of Earth has been called Anthropocene, which, as a name for the epoch, transforms into a cultural concept of influential argument in terms of duality of nature and society. The apocalypse epoch engages with the climate crisis, which coincides with environmental collapse. Hall explores the dystopian potential of Earth's transition, quote, "rapidly and irreversibly into a state of unknown in human experience," unquote, Barnowski. Because this contemporary imaginative fiction is haunted by prospects of planetary death, of irreversible environmental disaster. The novel depicts that after that collapse, natural sources are depleted, pollution reached the peak point, cities are submerged by the deadly flows, explained as, quote, "We crossed the swollen brown water of Eden after the electrical grid had powered down and darkness was spreading over the town. The flooding was worse around the bridge. Even the rain is different now, erratic, violent, not the constant gray diesel of old postcards, jokes, and television reports. It's rain that feels wounded. The massive floods hit the most important symbolic place of the power and authority, the Houses of Parliament, as a foreshadowing that this women army will hit the House of the Authority. Quote, "Not long after that, the Thames flood barrier had been overwhelmed and tidal water had filled the building," unquote. James Moore claims that capitalism is a time of economic and technological power that destroyed nature. That's not only humans and society, but also capitalism is responsible for the environmental crisis. While Anthropocene puts human in the center, capitalism puts capital in the center for destroying the earth. The biggest global concern in modern world, which is the age of capital, is, quote, "world ecology of power, capital, and nature," unquote, Moore. Moore calls this conceptual thinking as green arithmetic formulation. Quote, "Society plus nature equals history. Today it is humanity or society, or capitalism plus nature equals catastrophe." Hall's green dystopian feature depicts the case of the catastrophe caused by the effects of the eternal triangle of humanity, society, and capitalism in world ecology. So the novel depicts how environmental, socioeconomic, and political collapse are intertwined. Like the dystopian environment and nature, the government and the power are captured and controlled by the harsh regime of civil reorganization led by authority, who created a military police force. It was un-British, but American, unquote. This apocalyptic narrative portrays a dystopian capitalist future of Britain, which is, quote, "now little more than a dependent colony of the United States, big capital, from which food and fuel are imported," unquote. The brand on tuna fish that Sister East explains this situation better. Quote, "American and British flags flew in opposite directions from the same flagpole. Lord, keep us from the forces of evil. Bless our sacred liberty, and let those in darkness find your light. God save the king," unquote. Terrorist attacks hit the country. The city had been polluted. The oil runs out. House prices increased because of the insurance scandals. Economic crisis reached the peak point with collapse of the market and recession. Jobs were lost. The control of food, energy, and reproductivity made the people silent slaves. Since the socio-economic life was corrupted, the health system went upside down. Quote, "The health system cracked apart. Epidemics swept through the quarters in every town and cities. There were new viruses too aggressive to treat," unquote, Hall. "There's a new life entered a new epoch after the collapse makes life conditions very hard. The survived humanity is getting lost as the overdose and suicide rates climb." So I argue that the green arithmetic of dystopian Britain is transformed towards an inhabitable environment surrounded by viruses in which women are subordinated and suppressed by the authority of capital and power. Haraway calls the new epoch Tulicin as, quote, "a kind of time-place for learning to stay with trouble of living and dying in responsibility on a damaged earth," unquote. Carhelian women learn to stay with trouble in the time of, quote, "the Tulicin, past, present, and to come," unquote. Haraway criticizes the Anthropocene and the capitalism, sounding a pessimist tone of game over, too late attitude. Instead, the era Tulicin is, quote, "made up of ongoing multi-species stories and practices of becoming with in time that remain at stake in precarious times in which the world is not finished yet and the sky had not fallen yet." Haraway asserts that the earth is full of refugees, human or not, without refuge. To transfer into the next epoch, the time of Tulicin is depicted in a different way, that women refugees from environmental disaster and the abusive regime of authority come together in the Carhelian army to live in balance and harmony with what is left from non-human nature through resisting against oppressive environmental policies of the dictator regime. So in Stacey Lehman's term, quote, "the material interconnections of human corporeality with the more than human world," unquote, seems, quote, "interlaced in the transcorporeal domino effect of toxic events," unquote, Srelena. The no-name narrator sister, called unofficial by the authority, is the rebel fighter and the last woman who covertly escapes from the repressive regime of the authority and joins to the women commune rebels, the Karhulian army. There is a transcorporeal relationship between human women and the non-human landscapes nature. Even sister's name is absent, representing the absent nature after the disaster of climate change. Quote, my name is sister. This is the name that was given to me 3 years ago. It was what the others called me. It is what I call myself. Before that, my name was unimportant. I can't remember it being used. I will not sign to acknowledge it. It's gone. You will call me sister, unquote. We see a transition from a forgotten dark nature of the authority, where sister also prefers to forget her name, oppressed identity, to the utopian nature of hope, the form of daughters of Mother Earth, where sister narrates her story with an independent, strong, freer, and collective sisterhood identity. Both women's bodies and natural body of Earth are controlled and exploited by the authority. Just as women's fertility is restricted, nature is turned into petrochemical and black-turned land. So the body of women and the environment becomes toxic and polluted and become the subjects of the government. What was left from the collapsed environment are toxic bodies, minds, relationships, and toxic governments. All portrays an apocalyptic dystopian future of Earth, with image of a dying planet. The air is filled with the petrochemical emissions and the rot of uncollected rubbish, unquote, whole. Petrochemicals give harm both to the fertility women and to the nature. Thus, land and women's body are polluted by those metals, gas, and chemicals. Sister cannot recognize, quote, the yellow-eyed, red-beaked birds and the plants. There were dead bulbs in the soil and the roots of drowned plants, unquote. The only place where there is freedom for women and their bodies is Karhulian army, which is peculiarly cultivated. The novel depicts that collapsed economy is the main reason of the biopolitical governance of women's bodies. Authority controls reproduction by requiring that every woman of childbearing age is fitted with contraceptive coils, IUDs, with only some enabled to reproduce via lottery. So the authority holds the biopower, which is a form of power that regulates social life from its interior. Thus, what the regime code is directly at stake in power is the production and reproduction of life itself, unquote, Foucault. Capital and women's lives, bodies are interrelated to the relation between the land and climate change. So women's body becomes a sexual meta abused by the power authority just as the land. When the doctor fits the coil in the vagina of sister, quote, inserting the speculum and attaching the device as efficiently as a farmer clipping the ear of one of his herd, unquote. The novel depicts that women under the authority of power are driven like a sheep, clipped not by their ears, but by their vaginas, so that not to escape from the patriarchal control of reproductivity. It is like implanting a microchip to their body to detect viruses. The novel depicts how dictator government controls women's bodies through the state-controlled contraceptive coils under the cover of preventing environmental toxicity. Hall claims that, quote, women represent life, reproduction, genesis, and the state governing of their biology has taken on a variety of nightmarish forms, unquote. Sister devolves to this corrupted biopolitical and biocapitalist governance of the authority, which abuses women's bodies as controllable bio-objects and leaves her oppressed identity, name, rapist husband, and corrupted life behind that becomes object of political governance by the patriarchy. The women army called the Daughters of North refers to daughters of Earth who are hiding in the pastoral setting of the northern upland and fighting with the father authority. Mythological figures for the Mother Earth goddess like Gaia, Rhea, Cybele, Medusa, and so many others symbolize the creator of life, but also demoniac destroyer or killer. Mother Earth is angry, while an uncontrollable living organism whose primary responsibility is not only caring and nurturing, but also torturing and punishing inhabitants who try to devalue her natural body and kill her by sending chaos to the humanity, such as storms, floods, droughts, earthquakes, and other natural disasters. Gaia hypothesis was formulated by British chemist James Lovelock and American microbiologist Lynn Michaelis in 1972. Gaia is introduced as a new figure of nature, an autopathic system, a living planet, and a single organism that can change all life on itself. Gaia, quote, was once gentle, feminine, and nurturing, but also ruthless, cruel to those who transgress, unquote, Lovelock. Like, quote, non-innocent monsters, unquote, Haraway. The flood is maybe the tears of earth that we should read the message that hear the cries of the world, the mother nature, Gaia, and to stop destruction. Hall describes environmental destruction through personification as if nature is a woman who is raped by the smoke of the capital. Mother Earth is raped by the male-oriented pollution and industrial machines as a result of authorities' capitalist power. Personification of nature is also seen when Sister was captured and put into the iron metal tank that she feels she was caught in the mouth of an iron woman. Her teeth were closed around me. I heard the cracking of her legs as she strode, like panels of metal beating in the wind, unquote. The metal iron woman symbolizes Mother Earth, whose nature was distracted and captured by the capitalist industry, like women's bodies are captured in metal coils. Many women escape from torture, violence, rape, and murder to find hope for freedom and to release their anger. So this ecological farm becomes a place for rehabilitation for them. Nature becomes a hope for them. Women in this pastoral commune become stronger to fight for their freedom, to get their rights, land, future back, and they revolt to change the system of patterns. Following the myth, we see the same demon type of women like the daughters of Gaia, that the Carhulian women are great warriors who are called a witch, nuns, religious freaks, communists, child disorders, man haters, and even called as a gang of bloody terrorists by the patriarchal society. The mythological anger of Mother Earth is portrayed with the speech of Sister. She says, quote, "Women are naturally just as violent. We have begun used to waiting, hoping to be saved, hoping those in charge will reform and reform us. Sisters, no one is going to help us. There is only us, so why not here? Why not now?" Unquote. They attack the authority with their guns and bombs. However, in the end, they fail and lose men and women on the battlefield. Sister is arrested and put into the prison, but her last statement at the court also passes her hopes for women and nature in the future. Their bravery will not be forgotten, and others will follow them. This is just the beginning, unquote. The novel gives the message that the struggle of daughters of Mother Earth has just started, with plants a seed of hope in the hearts of women under the suppressive control of authority. That is, hope within the darkness is green within faded dystopia. So the catastrophic fate of Earth will not change unless the patriarchal capitalist regime is over. So humanity should learn to stay with trouble. Both human and non-human code require each other in an unexpected collaboration and combinations. We become with each other or not at all, unquote, Harvey. We should pay enough attention not to annoy or upset our Mother Earth anymore, who already started to take revenge by sending coronavirus to the threat of capitalist authority. Thank you so much. Before I want to close my talk with a call for paper that we have just established, our Journal of Posthumanism, that you can see the deadline to January 2021. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sümeyra. Thank you. Everybody, please just join me in thanking our panelists one more time. We'll open it up to questions now. We have a very capacious half hour remaining, which we can take up fully or partially, however we decide. I mean, as all of you witnessed, there's a tremendous amount of overlap and implicit dialogue between the presentations. And so, you know, one thing that I would invite our presenters to do is to ask each other questions, because I'm sure you've heard resonances and potentially points of generative dialogue in other folks' presentations. I certainly have questions for each and every presenter and general questions for the group, but yeah, and those of you who want to ask questions via chat, I invite you to do so, or you can ask, you know, just by unmuting yourself visually and audioly. So, all right, so I invite folks to ask questions. So if I could just jump in, I guess, and ask Rachel a question, because I think that some of the terms that you introduced in your presentation will provide us a vocabulary, conceptual vocabulary for talking about the rest of the papers. It seems to me that a lot of the presentations were dealing indirectly with this idea of like a polygenic disease, and I think generally with how various modes of cultural production have responded to the consequences and effects of the end of the American century, American decline, as it produces environmental collapse, as it produces these conditions and conjunctures in which polygenic disease is created and then goes and evades knowledge production and evades care institutions. So you mentioned something in the beginning of your presentation, Rachel, a distinction that you wanted to make between what you're calling polymerized violence and a sort of broader discourse of the toxic airborne events. And I was wondering if you could just go over that distinction again, and then maybe say a little bit about how it relates to your conceptualization of polygenic disease.
Thanks, Chris. Wow, you really hit at the core of what I haven't worked out yet, but I can work out this one. But in terms of polygenic and the queer turn towards the end, it's still not quite worked out. But yeah, so toxic airborne event, everyone sort of knows that from Don DeLillo, right, from White Noise. And what struck me, interestingly, is in a lot of anthropologies of chemicals, there is always a epigraph of, DeLillo. And so this to me was a sign of, right, there's some way in which that particular nugget encapsulates as a wonderful figure for attuning to the atmosphere, et cetera. And yet, I start out with Michelle Murphy, thinking about, well, at the same time, you have these thinkers, waste scholars, for instance, that are very much speaking about the insufficiency of speaking about the molecular on that level. And then also the toxic airborne event is named as such, right? It's this dark cloud from Niodine, whatever, D. Whereas polymerized violence is also about the everyday, right? So polymers are in everything that we live with. So it's also about the everydayness of this violence and the sort of invisibility in all the products that we have that are basically petrochemically derived. We have it. And also in our structures of racism and labor and care work, as Karen was pointing out, we also have this sort of everyday toxicity that we live in. And so that's what I'm hoping polymerized violence does for us, which is bring it into the everyday. I know, Chris, that I'm working on a lot of stuff that's in military contexts, and that screens toxicity in a big way with weaponry and necropolitics, but there's also the toxicity underlying the biopolitical of the everyday and what we do in our worlds where we cultivate life. In terms of polygenic, so part of, and this actually will resonate with many of the other talks, my question for everyone was about the figure of reproductive labor, that basically, domestic care work that comes up in Karen's work, and also obviously in Sümeyra's work as well. But I was wondering about what reproductive care labor would be in Scott's analysis. I know that there was that turn to the intimate and the erotic and the affective. And I was like, well, is that where it lives? And is the aesthetic reproductive care work? Anyway, we'll think about that. But the reason why I wanted to talk about the polygenic is, so I'm dealing with a lot of oral histories right now, and I'm trying to think through the insufficiency of the activist and the artistic in, we actually asked about those practices in relation to their illness experiences. And almost always people wanted validation from science or social science. They wanted that kind of, mechanistic, we're going to find it thing, right? So, part of doing this project is about figuring out, where humanities methods can intervene. And I think it's in that space, this is what I was trying to suggest, in that space of the blankness, of the counterfactual, of the being able to ally and go out in different ways. So much can be accomplished that cannot be if you go with the exactness of the molecule, even as, that little thing, it wasn't a molecule, but it's that Lyme disease thing. Oh, a tick has come off of you, something has been transferred. That is the incipit to doing a stellonic reaching out. That is an interesting way to turn it around. So that's kind of what I meant by the polygenic. Polygenic means too many things, we can't figure out the cost, so therefore we can't treat you under the VA, right? And you're left with idiopathic, which means you're crazy. That's what it actually means, right? That proliferation of mental illness and madness and stigmatization. And the way to return to cure or to something that substitutes your cure is the attainment of the sort of heterosexual sufficiency as the head of household. And that's what I was trying to get at with this whole quinceanera thing that happens in the end. And I was really interested in, Karen, when you kept saying cure and contagion, what you thought of around changing the term of cure to sort of something like interdependency, right? Because, you know, cure in disability context is very much what you don't want to be subject to, right? Because it's kind of an erasure, it's kind of like a eugenic erasure of the disabled. So what would it mean to change the framework to interdependency and reproductive care work? And what do we do with representational issues in that, like that affective aesthetic thing that all of us are sort of interested in if we come from, you know, art history, and literary studies. Sorry, that was a very long answer. Anyone can jump in.
Yeah, maybe I can continue. Thank you, Rachel, for your good comments and contribution. I think all our papers are interrelated to each other. After I listened to all of you, I feel that, wow, we're in the right session. Karen, I like your saying that virus is inside us, not coming from outside. Like how women feel themselves outsiders in our patriarchal world. And unfortunately, as you said, xenophobia, racism, and sexism and othering still continue. And Rachel, as you told, I like your theorizing about environmental toxicity and molecular feminism on Netflix diagnosis, and Scott's environmental visitors on body, focusing on human and non-human animal binary. Yeah, I feel that all of our talks are interrelated. But I have a question to you, Rachel. Is there any gender focus in diagnosis in terms of memory loss and mental illness? I mean, do you think that women are more affected by biochemical toxicity?
So I will let you know that in diagnosis in particular, it is Willie, it's focused on Willie, and I don't know if you can call it an ungendering in the sense of, you know, this notion of being like a kid. And then, you know, it's really as if head of household. It's clear that Sandra is the head of household though now, right? But Willie sort of needs to perform the father that can give his daughter a quinceanera, which is like, you know, acknowledging that she's a woman and available, you know, for intimacy and marriage and children, et cetera. But in the work that I'm doing on these oral histories, we still have a lot of disproportionately female interviewees. But the prevalence numbers, according to Ann Steinemann, are actually like, there are a lot of men. If you include Gulf War service as part of environmental illness, then it's probably even, right? So it's also how we categorize what gets attention and what gets covered and what gets research money versus what doesn't. That's partly why we asked the question about political activism, right? So we also worked with domestic workers, in fact, and spoke to them about their exposures to toxicity in this moment. And because they had already been oriented towards activism through the California Domestic Workers Alliance, they were the most articulate people on all of the issues, like on the structural issues of being undocumented and getting healthcare, et cetera. And they were majority cis women, not all, but majority cis women, cis female. So that's the answer to the gender. But I'm hoping that we can all talk about whether reproductive labor is, you know, how does it figure against this notion of toxicity? Maybe that's like the easiest way to put it, or to waste management, or to appreciation of urban ecologies that are, you know, thoroughly saturated with petrochemical products that don't decay?
I'll respond to Rachel's wonderful question. And I really loved everyone's presentation. I enjoyed like how everyone's thematically and theoretically aligned with one another, and seeing so much material that I've never seen before. To get at Rachel's question on sort of my use of the word cure, in the longer version of much longer a version of this paper, I go into theoretically go into autoimmunity and immunity to kind of get at how unhealthy the charter's like obsession, their obsession, almost addiction to like finding a cure is, to the point where they themselves almost, to use autoimmunity terms, they attack themselves, like they attack the means of what, the means of how they could find a cure, which is FAN. Mirroring how so many Asian American healthcare workers right now, while they're providing healthcare to COVID patients, are victims of racism and xenophobia. So, I mean, that's kind of why I stick to the word cure. I mean, I'm not married to it, but that's why, like, it's in relation to like their own unhealthiness. Like they don't see what the narrator of the novel sees, which is that they've spent so much money trying to figure out a cure. They've kind of relentlessly hunted down Fan. They've kidnapped her partner Reg, all in service of finding a supposed cure. And at the end, like she just disappears, perhaps runs away. And I'm not sure how to answer your question on reproductive labor, but it's just pushing away. The end of the novel is like a pushing away of reproductive labor, given that Fan is pregnant, and she does represent, along with her pregnancy, sort of the hope of the novel, which the narrator of the novel states that she's the hope. It resembles Ling Ma's novel Severance. How that also is an Asian American novel which focuses on an Asian American female protagonist, and it ends with her pregnant and separated from everyone else because the group she was with was trying to control her, because in part because she figures that she could be immune, very similarly to Fan in Ting Riley's novel.
Yeah, maybe I can answer to Rachel's question as well. In terms of reproductive labor, in the novel that I analyzed, women escape to nature because the government bans them to get children by putting contraceptive coils to their body. So they, in terms of collectivity, they collect in that nature that's called Carhillan army in order to be free, or to make free to their bodies, uncontrolled by the government and biochemical policy, controlling policy. So I think they establish a kind of reproductive labor community, but on the other side, they also create a kind of authoritative policy in their community, that they shave their heads and they just pretend to be soldiers, and they attack to the government, but they forgot about their reproductivity. That's my comment.
Rachel, I'll respond to your question about the conjunction of urban ecologies and the kind of ubiquity of polymerized violence in the form of petrochemical technologies that we're all inundated with. What Concrete Jungle, as my case study, is really kind of responding to, I think, is a number of things, but one of them being the shift from steady state ecology to post-stasis ecology. So the idea that ecosystems are dynamic, they're always changing, there's no such thing as homeostasis. Disruption is a kind of internalized and ever-present factor and variable within ecological systems. And so that becomes its sort of background information, I think, for thinking about the city, not simply as a site of damage, right? Which is how it came to be figured within a more steady state ecological understanding of things, thinking about it instead as this sort of dynamic system. And the problem that I think that this doesn't address is one that Donald Worster, the environmental historian, raised in 1990 when he said, okay, so if now our kind of baseline template for understanding ecology is that deterioration is already there, then how do we make political, moral, analytical judgments about environmental damage? What's the new criteria that accords with post-stasis ecology for us to be able to say that this is damaging? And I think that Concrete Jungle and other works, sometimes in animal studies, sometimes in contemporary art, get hung up on this fascination with the principles of post-stasis ecology and the ever-present internal variable that is disruption. And they can't, or sometimes just don't, swing over into a more overtly political proclamation on the balance between maybe dynamic deterioration and disruption and actual violence, like the form that you're articulating, ubiquitous, polymerized violence. And so I tried to signal my ambivalence towards Concrete Jungle there. It's a conundrum, I think, that continues to be lacking in some of these works that use garbage, pests, weeds, etc., as their sort of aesthetic, optic, and material. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it's more of like a question for all of us in the sense that I too, I don't know if, when you said you're ambivalent, I talk about as wavering. Like I waver between loving the fact that something does not have a singular instrumental use, right? Because that's what makes it less than propaganda. And also kind of critiquing that it could be used to other ends, right? That its ambivalence is merely aesthetic or something like that. And I guess I did want to ask us all if there is something to, because I'm working on Ocean Vuong as well, right? So on Earth, we are briefly gorgeous, right? So like the idea of beauty, right? And turning to beauty. And this is also about like the beauty of nail polish, which is also totally toxic. But, whether that's also reproductive labor, like in that book, it totally is. And actually, and on Such a Full Sea, it totally is as well. Remember the mani-pedi? So there's something about, you could make functional the mindset of turning to the aesthetic or the spiritual, right? Even if it's like that whole notion of like Buddhist long time, that's how you become less scared and anxious about your own death because you're thinking about deep time, and suffering cycles. And yet once I say that, I'm like, oh, right, that's what we do in yoga. That's not what we do in a seminar on toxicity.
This conversation reminds me of The Great Derangement by Ghosh, and how he calls for novel forms that completely prioritize environmentalism to the point where there's almost nothing left else. And for me, that's always been troubling for me, because what is sort of the point of the novel when it resembles like a Greenpeace pamphlet? Like, what is the point of reading novel after novel that is so restrictive in form and message and propaganda? At least for me, there's no beauty in a novel that is specifically like that. Everyone knows about environmentalism at this point. Whether they deny it or accept it is another story. But everyone knows about environmental changes and climate change at this point. I don't necessarily think it's, at least with the novel form, I don't necessarily think it's like we have to, crank out novel after novel that is solely about environmentalism. I think the more effective novels that I've read that are environmental are the ones that integrate environmentalism into daily life. Like, you cannot be 100% environmental, especially when we participate in capitalism. There is no 100% way to be completely environmental all the time.
Right. Yeah. Like Adorno said, there's wrong life can't be lived rightly. I love this question about the aesthetic that Rachel has raised, and this was one of the questions that I had for the group, and I really love how you evoked gauche there, Karen, because I think gauche really frames a lot of this issue of the aesthetic and its affordances when it comes to issues like this. And it seems like like Rachel was mentioning before about the sort of constant turn, or the trope of the genre of this molecular criticism to, in the end, turn to DeLillo and the toxic airborne event. It seems like the aesthetic does have a kind of affordance in terms of how it's able to figure or prefigure the kinds of overdetermined realities that affect us on an everyday level, but that can't be sort of reified in institutional language. Things like Gulf War syndrome, right? Or various forms of polygenic disease. And when Rachel was speaking earlier, I was reminded of when you were speaking about chronic fatigue syndrome. It's a heavily gendered disease. I think it affects women like disproportionately in relation to men, but also the way that people sort of talk about in popular discourse, it's a heavily gendered disease as well. But this is an example of a polygenic disease that I think the kind of polygenic disease that that it's difficult to aestheticize. I think and evokes returns us to the kinds of questions that we're exploring here. But okay, so this is I have one comment and one question for Karen and Scott. So the comment is for everyone sort of in general, and I think the reproductive labor as a kind of trope that runs throughout everybody's presentation. It's this aesthetic trope. Even with Diagnosis, which is in this kind of documentary format, there's an aesthetic choice that the producers make to have the quinceañera as this kind of narrative recuperation of Willie's masculinity and status as the family patriarch. But it seems like throughout the presentation, reproductive labor, in its kind of narrative or tropological status, isn't really signaling the kind of futurity that maybe we would associate with another sort of very well-known moment of reproductive futurity in recent science fiction, that Children of Men, the ending scene in the boat named Tomorrow, and On Such a Full Sea, as a kind of reworking of that trope. Severance as a reworking of that trope also. But reproductive labor really seems to be performing as a trope, seems to be performing this kind of figural or prefigural kind of function of, helping us to conceptualize, the toxic airborne event, or the kind of polygenesis of everyday life in the midst of sort of an overdetermined ongoing set of catastrophes. So that was a kind of general comment for everybody. And one, actually, I'm going to hold off on the question because it veers into pets. and it might take us away from reactions to what I just said and everything that that Karen and Rachel just said. So if folks want to respond to that, I invite you, but I can, if not, then I can ask the pets question.
So also in the longer version of this paper, so I talk a lot about sort of the body, the shape of her body as literal shape of her body as pregnant and how she conceals it in the story. And I talk about how sort of the trope of pregnancy in sci-fi, like in not just Severance, but in Octavia Butler's Wild Seed, and okay, another one's not coming to mind. But anyways, Lee has said this in an interview that he wanted to use Fan as a vessel for imagination in the novel, and then within the narrative itself, the plot and the narrator mirrors that, using Fan as a vessel. Like in a way, Fan is like an ode to a Grecian urn. Like, because you don't know what happens to her at the end, she's just always pregnant. She has never given birth to the child. The Be More community can just keep using her, reproducing her as a pregnant woman, an image of inspiration for revolt and protest.
I have a strange kind of response to the figure of reproductive labor in Concrete Jungle. And that is, it doesn't come up as much in terms of human reproductive labor as care work, but reproduction, biological reproduction, is a kind of recurring figure trope throughout the book, insofar as it continually refers to pests and weeds, which are the terms that it uses, while also problematizing those words. But it continually refers to them by their scientific name of our selected species. So species like rats or invasive species who come into a territory and have no naturally selected checks placed on them, other than the fact that they have shorter lifespans and they reproduce very quickly and very broadly. And so their only naturally selected check is basically how fast and far they can reproduce. So the idea of the rat infiltrating the city and reproducing wildly until you have something like one rat for every person in New York, whether or not that old statistic is true is another story. But that's the trope that kind of runs throughout the book, is that the rat, the cockroach, etc., are all our selected species. And the sort of care work that then looks for or looks to is how then to ecologically manage cities, urban centers, so that the sort of invasive reproduction of our selected species isn't, running wild. So it's striking this sort of this critical, sometimes agnostic ambivalence about these questions that I take issue with in this book. Is on the one hand, it's looking at the city as a fertile space for our selected species to flourish. On the other hand, it's looking at pest management procedures as like a vital aspect of care work, but it's not really settling on either one. And that's why I keep returning to this phrase of agnosticism, because if you're assuming a sort of naturalist approach to the city to think about it as an ecosystem, then the proliferation of rats is, really interesting material. But when you're living in underprivileged community that's deliberately starved of resources, then having rats climbing throughout your building is not really an interesting matter. It's a bad one. It's one that needs to be remedied. It's one that needs to be fixed. So yeah, I don't know. That was kind of like an open statement, wandering statement in response to reproduction. But I just wanted to flag that it is there in this book, if at times kind of problematically so.
Great. So, I want to be mindful of everybody's time. It's 2:03 right now. But if there are any questions from the audience or any final thoughts, everybody knows that I have my pets question in my holster right now, but I can hold off on that. But if anybody, if there are any final thoughts or final questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. To speak about, to speak in the language of reproduction. Okay, well, I will leave you wondering what my pet's question was, but let everybody please join me in thanking our panelists. Once again, this was a really fascinating discussion. I mean, we just blew past 35 minutes of Q&A, and I think if I wasn't being so draconian about the time, that we could go on for much longer. But thank you so much again, everybody. I hope to see you next week for our our techno-capitalism panel, the last panel in our symposium. Thanks so much again, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, I want to hear the pets question. Are you going to?
Oh, the pet.
Yeah.
Okay, if anybody wants to hang around. No, I was just wondering because Scott, both you and Karen, pets come up in your presentations, and I was just wondering how pets as a trope. Why you think perhaps pets as this trope comes to mediate these questions about reproductive labor and figuring or prefiguring modes of relationality in this time of sort of like state degradation that accompanies environmental collapse. It seems just like a really, really rich, I don't know, set of relationships, a rich set of aesthetic forms that troubles and I think really like intensely queers relationality under conditions of catastrophe. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were about like why pets? I mean, that's one of the weirdest parts of On Such a Full Sea is that this practice of keeping is evoked. And Scott, like those pictures of the upright dogs, definitely weird to evoke a term in your title. And so I'm just wondering, what do you think the function of that is?
I mean, so with pets, it is such like the most jarring thing in the novel, like the keeping of human beings, but then they're kind of not human beings anymore. They're becoming non-humans as pets, which I think is part of the point. And I think sort of that episodic encounter with Miss Kathy as with Fan as her pet. I think it just shows the ocular-centric assumption that she places onto Fan, that she's tiny, like she looks 12 or 10, I forget what the novel says, but she looks like 12 or 10, but then she's actually 16, but Miss Kathy just completely assumes that, one, she's incredibly young, like too young to be pregnant, young enough to be molded into one of the other girls, into a docile pet. I don't know if this fully addresses your question, but that's kind of how I perceive it. It's another way for Asian American characters in the novel to be dehumanized and also treated with ocular-centric racist assumptions.
In the case of Concrete Jungle, I think that the trope of the pet comes up because it provides a sort of borderland between I should say unstable borderland between the category of the human and the category of the animal, which for Dion and Rockman is capable of destabilizing both categories. So the way that they show that is by looking at different types of pets and different types of different situations in which animals that are normally pets become desocialized or they feralize. So they look, for instance, at a lot of different discourse on rats, and one of the discourses is by a rat enthusiast who keeps them as pets. And so it kind of uses the figure of the rat as pet as a way of upsetting this kind of human-animal boundary that defines the rat as a pest, as a kind of diseased other, as this marker of pathology, etc. On the other hand, there's an interview with an ethologist who studies feral dogs, and he looks at situations in which dogs don't fully feralize, but they'll kind of hang in this region in between domestication and feral. So stray dogs in Newark, New Jersey was this person whose name I can't recall, forgive me, their doctoral work. And what they found is that stray dogs within the city quickly resumed pack mentalities. And there was a hierarchy, there were rituals, there were very routine practices that the dogs engaged in the form of a pack. But all of those practices were shaped around who they could get food from, where they could get food from, and what they could inhabit. So these dogs, even though they kind of reassembled a sort of pre-domesticated pack formation, they remained socialized towards humans. Beyond that, there's other cases that this ethologist studied in New Mexico, I believe, somewhere in the Southwest, I think New Mexico, in which the dogs returned to a state of full fertilization, and you couldn't approach them as a human, not because it was necessarily dangerous, but because the dogs were too wary of humans and you wouldn't be able to get close to them. So here's an instance in which, you know, the pet is kind of wavering between or mediating between different figurations or formations of humanness and animality, either as something that's considered pathological entering into human spaces as an accepted and familiar species in the case of rat pets, or companion species like dogs becoming other, becoming referalized, reassuming pack mentalities, etc. So I think that's why the pet comes up here, is just since it's so capable of coming undone or becoming unstable.
I'm really glad I asked that question. That was really, those are two really fascinating responses. And you know, this idea of feralization, I feel like Fan On Such a Full Sea must have been described as feral or like using some sort of cognate term. But just as this thing that's sort of returning to nature, she's occupying this liminal space, obviously, this liminal ontological space, or this kind of relation of animacy between the anthropocentric and the like completely natural or Piscine, as it's is one of the terms that's used in the novel. But feralization as this, you know, kind of like hovering state that has a potential at negotiating or mediating the anthropocentric with the natural, the sort of like cure with disease and all these other things. It's a really fascinating and fecund concept. So thank you so much for that.
Can I throw one thing in?
Yes, please.
You know how there are these invasive species that result because people get tired of their pets and release them into the wild?
Yeah.
The
Crocodiles.
About sort of, it's not really sanctioned, but you probably won't be criminalized for abandonment, right? So there are all those COVID dog adoptions, and then like these returns, when people went to work. So there's something too about the pet that's also about, almost like a contractual in a bad way, relationality, which is, oh, I can give it up at any time and I won't be prosecuted for it. I don't know, there's something about that, but I definitely want an insectivore dog. So if that's ever invented, I definitely want that.
Agreed.
Yeah, sign me up too. Okay, well, thanks so much. Thanks so much, everybody. Again, that was really wonderful. And I guess stay safe, everybody. We'll see you hopefully again next week.
It's
Okay,
12.
bye.
Thanks,
Well, right?
everyone.
Go ahead. What was that, Rachel?
It's again at 12, or has the time?
It's at 11 a.m. next Friday.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye.